Lion in the Wind, Chapter 30. Delgra fired, chambered another round, and fired again. The battle was getting edgy, as it seemed like all their efforts to push forward were coming to nothing. He swore, and then fired on another of black soldiers as he ran between one of the buildings. The man crumpled to the ground and lay still. Just then Delgra spotted two men trying to flank him. He quickly drew a bead and took out the first man, and then watched the second disappear behind a door. He guessed where the man was at inside the building and fired. He watched for a moment to see if he emerged out the other side. When he didn't, Delgra was sure he'd gotten him. Two grenades exploded in front of him, sending dirt spraying everywhere. Delgra swore again. "We need to flank these guys." "Got any ideas?" he shouted. "Just one, but we'd need an LAV to do it," shouted Odivian. "Well, we're fresh out of LAVs. So got any other ideas?" Odivian looked around briefly, and then said, "How about an old army truck?" "Sounds like a grand idea if you're contemplating suicide," said Delgra. "Well, I think someone is," shouted Odivian as he pointed behind them. Delgra looked at Odivian curiously, and then turned around just in time to see an army truck barreling down the highway towards them. "Get out of the way," shouted Delgra. He turned to run, and then stopped and stared in confusion as he spotted a small service droid hanging off the hood of the truck. "What in the blazes?" he said in surprise. A moment later the truck barreled past them as Brakeman braced himself against the hail of bullets flying towards him and held on for all he was worth. At the last second he dove off the side of the truck and rolled away as it plowed into the bunker in front of him. It exploded with an earth-shaking boom that silenced the bunker and shattered the barrier that had been blocking Delgra's advance. With lightning-quick reflexes, Brakeman then leapt to his feet and charged at several dazed and confused soldiers nearby. The soldiers tried to respond, but they were so shell-shocked that the best they could do was point their weapons in Brakeman's general direction. Taking advantage of this, he disarmed the first soldier and shot him with his own rifle. But when the gun jammed, he instead turned it into a club and beat the second man unconscious. He then quickly scanned the area. Seeing that all was clear, and the battle had momentarily grown silent, Brakeman quickly gathered together his spiders and raced forward into the facility. "Brakeman, don't run any further. Your task lies elsewhere." "Turn away," came Mashua's voice in his mind. "I can't. I've got to save Mom and Dad," he shouted as he ran. "What's in here?" asked Oik as he stared at a large, yellow tank. "Benzene. They use it for cleaning parts," said Bergen. Oik nodded in approval. "That'll do," he said. He then turned to one of his men, and said, "Wire it up." "Heads up. We've got company," shouted one of the hunters. A moment later a wave of gunfire poured into the room. Oik swore. "Quickly! Get charges on those tanks. Put them up high so that Black's men won't see them. The rest of you, secure that door. Don't let anyone get in here until we're done," he shouted. Bergen turned to one of the men as he drew several charges out of his pouch. "Let me have some of those." "I'll help," he said. The man stared curiously at Bergen, and then at Oik, who nodded. The man handed Bergen 6 charges. "Place these wherever you feel the tank is most vulnerable," he said. Bergen nodded. "And don't drop them. I'd hate to have this place blow up before we're clear," said Oik. Bergen grimaced. "I'm not the one you have to worry about dropping them," he said as he handed 2 charges to Persia. She quickly bounded up the pipes leading away from the tanks and planted the charges on the top of the tank. Oik nodded in approval. She then repeated the maneuver 2 more times, placing the remaining 4 charges at other strategic points. Just as she finished, one of Oik's men came running up to him. "All charges have been placed," he said. "All right, tell the other men to pull back. We're getting out of here." The man nodded and hurried off just as a huge explosion rocked the building. Glass, metal and stone flew through the air as a cloud of dust quickly filled the room. "They've breached the main doors. They're coming through," shouted one of Oik's men. "Pull back. Pull back, shouted Oik. The men quickly complied. Moments later, a large group of Black's men poured through the shattered main doors and into the building. For the next several minutes an intense battle raged between the two groups as both fought desperately for control of the facility. After several minutes the battle seemed to lessen. But this was only the calm before the storm, as a second, larger group of Black's men poured through the door. Bergen ducked as bullets whizzed over his head while Oik's men struggled to repel this new onslaught. "Start pulling the men out the way we came," shouted Oik over the roar of battle. "We can't. All the exits are blocked," shouted one of his men in return. "Pinned in a corner to die like rats," thought Oik in frustration. He carefully studied the area around him and realized that they could not continue this battle much longer. They needed to get out, and fast. "Doctor, is there another way out of here?" asked Oik. "There's a service train that runs the length of the facility. It brings parts and supplies in for the maintenance crews. We could use it to get everyone out," said Bergen. "All right, lead the way," shouted Oik. Bergen carefully slipped out of his hiding spot and crawled frantically across the floor as Oik's men covered him. Once he was clear, Oik began pulling his men back through the manufacturing facility. They soon reached a side room where a small caged car sat waiting for them. Oik looked down the tunnel and said, "Where does this go to?" "Outside." "But you can't go down the tunnel. It's too dangerous. You need to use the transport car or you'll die." Oik grunted as he studied the small car. "But that's not big enough." "I know. You'll only be able to fit 20 men inside at a time. But we can still do this fast enough to get everyone out." "Now hurry up and get in," said Bergen. Oik nodded, and then sent all of his wounded out in the first trip. The rest of Oik's men were then evacuated in the next several trips until all that remained was Oik, a handful of his men, Bergen, and Persia. But it was at that moment that Bergen realized that they had a problem. "Doctor! Get in the car," shouted Oik. "I can't. The other terminal has gone offline. The only way to get you out is if someone stays here and operates the car from this end. I'll leave one of my men behind to operate it. We need to get you out of here." "No. You can't. None of your men know how to operate the controls, and I don't have time to teach them." Oik now found himself at an impasse. He didn't want to leave the doctor behind, but if he didn't, they would all die. "Oik! You need to go. Persia and I can escape through the roof access hatch. Trust me." "I know this facility," shouted Bergen. "But how will we know when you're out? We need to detonate those explosives soon before the guards have a chance to disarm them. Let me do it. When we're safe, I'll trigger the explosives." Oik hesitated, and then handed Bergen the detonator. "Mishwa protect you," he said proudly. He then stepped into the cage, closed the door and watched in dismay as they vanished into the service tunnel, leaving Bergen and Persia behind to fend for themselves. Once Bergen was sure that the men were safely away, he scurried across the room and quickly began climbing a ladder to the roof as Persia clung tightly to him. Just as he emerged through the hatch at the top he heard bullets rattle off the ladder below him. He quickly scrambled out, and then raced across the roof with Persia close on his heels. But they only made it a short ways before realizing that they were on the wrong side of the roof. Somehow they'd taken the wrong ladder. To make matters worse, there was no way to escape, save for either going back the way they'd come, or a nearly 5-story plunge to the concrete below. Just then a group of soldiers burst around the corner behind him. "Give it up, doctor. We have you cornered," said one of the men. Persia launched herself across the roof. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she roared as she dove at the startled men. She then attacked them with whirlwind-like fury, slashing, tearing and biting as though she'd gone mad. But her attack was short-lived as one of the soldiers put a round through her shoulder. She tumbled to the ground and writhed in agony. "Persia!" cried Bergen in abject terror. The soldiers soon got to their feet as others came in behind them. One of them stepped on Persia and pointed the muzzle of his rifle at her head. "Don't move, sweetie. I was told not to kill you if at all possible." But if you keep moving, I'm gonna have to put a bullet in your head, he said. Several other soldiers moved across the roof towards Bergen. All right, doctor, give up the gig. You're coming with us, said one of the men. Bergen looked down briefly at Persia, and then up at the soldiers. He soon pulled the detonator out of his pocket and held it out for the men to see. Touch me and I blow this whole building. The soldiers stopped. He's bluffing, said one of the men. Bergen raised the detonator over his head, and then suddenly felt a hot fire erupt in his chest. Hey, what did you shoot him for? Shouted one of the men. He was going to blow us up, shouted another. He's bluffing, you idiot. Geez, look at what you've done. If he dies, you die. I'll kill you if you try. The soldiers soon began to argue bitterly amongst themselves. Bergen's eyes went wide as he felt his chest burning as though a fire had been kindled between his ribs. He dropped to his knees and swayed awkwardly as his vision swam before him. He slowly turned his head and looked towards Persia as a sickening ring filled his ears. She seemed like she was shouting something at him. But what were the words? He studied her lips, and then the detonator, and then her again. She nodded. Now he understood. So this is what we were supposed to do, he thought. What a way to go, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He then cradled the detonator in his hands, flipped off the safety, and pressed the button. A powerful shockwave blew Brakeman off his feet and slammed him to the ground. He quickly picked himself up and looked on in horror as the manufacturing facility vanished before him into a massive mushrooming fireball. It was at this moment that a bitter, painful revelation pierced his heart. His parents had been in that building. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. Mom. Dad. No, he screamed bitterly as fear became reality before him. Then that fear turned to anger, and then anger to blinding rage. Black, he said, the name rolling bitterly off his lips. Seeing a piece of rod lying nearby, he picked it up and then turned towards the main administration building. Whatever it took, he was going to see Black punished for what he'd done. Oik looked on in mortified horror as the manufacturing facility vanished before him in a powerful, mushrooming fireball. Do you think they made it out alive? Asked one of his men. Oik sighed deeply. I want to believe they did. But deep down inside I know they didn't. How do you know that? When we were preparing for this mission, Meshwa told me to bring them along as they had a purpose to fulfill here. However, he said nothing about bringing them back, said Oik. He then pounded his chest in salute as did the other soldiers. In the beginning he was just a man. But in the end he became a warrior more honorable than even I, said Oik. He then turned to his men, and said, let's move out. We still have a mission to complete, and a madman to catch. Black swore under his breath as a fireball engulfed the manufacturing facility. He knew what this meant, and it enraged him. All of my plans are ruined, he screamed. He turned in the direction of the heaviest fighting, and growled, curse you and your lions. Just then bullets whizzed by his head. He turned to see Farragant's men closing in on him. Blast. I need to lose these fools. I will not let my dreams be destroyed, he said. He then turned and raced across the rooftops of the facility at breakneck speed, his cybernetic legs carrying him many times faster than any of the Gorg following him could run. Seeing an opportunity to hide, and get his bearings again, he slipped behind a nearby service structure and weighed his options. But just as he started to think about what he would do next, a Citizen hunter popped up over a ladder just in front of him. Black stared at him in shock and surprise, and then quickly realized the new peril he was in. He's over here, shouted the hunter. Black swore, and then hurried away. Chagani leapt high at Garmek in an effort to lure it into attacking. And right on cue, Garmek did. Chagani pulled his legs in, grabbed Garmek's swinging arm and pushed off from it. He then grabbed the giant robot's face and held on for dear life as they both tumbled backwards and crashed to the ground. Chagani quickly recovered and turned to attack Garmek, only to be batted away by one of Garmek's tentacles. Garmek then climbed to its feet and turned towards Chigani. Pen tried his luck next as Itika distracted the large metal brute. He leapt at the robot, expecting to drive a powerful kick into its back, only to be batted aside as well. Quickly recovering and landing on all fours, he turned and hurried over to Chigani. "You alright, bro?" he asked. Chigani nodded. "I'm fine. But we need to find another way to attack him. Our current methods are ill-capable of achieving victory." "Well, I'm open to suggestions if you have any. We should use whatever we can find in our environment. It might give us an advantage." Pen quickly glanced around the area. "Like what?" Chigani looked around and noticed that they were surrounded by huge buildings whose walls were made entirely of concrete. "Let's try to smash him into a few of these buildings. Maybe those might crack his armor." Delgra looked on in stunned silence as a massive fireball climbed into the night sky. "What's happening over there?" he said. "Sounds like Oik and Fergant may have joined the festivities," said Odivian. "I hope not. The last thing we need is for them to get caught in the crossfire, or worse yet, mistaken for the enemy." "Don't worry. They know what they're doing," said Odivian. One of the soldiers hurried up to Delgra and said, "Sir, we're receiving reports that the army has heard of our plight and is sending reinforcements." "For whose side?" "Ours apparently." Delgra nodded. "Good. We could use the help. But in the meantime we need to keep the pressure on Black's men. We have to give those lions more time." Black quickly bolted across the roof, leapt between the buildings, and landed awkwardly on the other side. He turned briefly to see if he was still being followed, and soon realized that he hadn't gained as much headway on his pursuers as he'd thought. He then turned and sprinted away in a bid to widen the gap. But before he made even 2 steps, something grabbed his feet and wrenched his legs out from under him. He shrieked in surprise as he crashed face first to the rooftop and skid painfully to a stop. He slowly climbed to his feet, and then paused in surprise and complete disbelief as he stared at a familiar face in front of him. "Brakeman! I thought we destroyed you." Brakeman raised a short metal rod that he held in his hand and smashed it squarely into Black's temple. A sickening crack echoed across the rooftop as Black's head snapped to the side so hard that it nearly broke his neck. His head then bobbed briefly as he tried to shake off the effects of the blow. "That's for Mom," growled Brakeman angrily. He lifted the rod over his head and drove it down into Black's skull, knocking him unconscious. "And that's for Dad." Seeing that Black was out cold, Brakeman dropped to his knees and gave out a bitter, anguished cry. He then tossed the rod to the side, grabbed Black's head, and prepared to snap his neck. "Brakeman! Stop!" came Meshwa's voice. Brakeman paused, and then looked up. Meshwa stood before him, his hands held out in a gesture to halt. "He killed Mom and Dad. He deserves to die," cried Brakeman angrily. He then groaned and lowered his head in sadness. "I deserve to die too. I couldn't save them. I failed. I'm worthless." He then released Black's head and plopped noisily to the ground. "You did what you were called to do, and they did what they were called to do. Brakeman, let it go and be at peace. They are with me now." Brakeman groaned sadly, buried his face in his hands, and wept bitterly. Meshwa sat down next to him, wrapped his arms around the little droid, and held him close.